Patience. I'm Corey Wilder, a scholarly assistant professor and marketing director for Murrow College. Thanks for joining us today at our second event in the Murrow Center for Student Success Speaker Series, The Power of Voice. This series celebrates how we express our unique style, personality, experience, and opinion by using our voices. At their worst, our voices disseminate misinformation, disinformation, and hate. At their best, we can use our voices to break down systemic barriers and open doors that may have otherwise remained locked. Today's panel discussion will, we hope, serve as a catalyst to engage community in discussions and dialogues surrounding diversity, equity, inclusion, race, and social justice issues. Please feel free to ask any questions you have and put them in the chat box as you think of them. We will monitor it throughout the discussion and will refer to the questions during the Q&A. For those in our audience who are eligible for common reading credit, please keep an eye on the chat for a link. You will need to fill out an online form in order to get credit. So that should be popped into the meeting room shortly. Okay, now I'm thrilled to introduce you to our moderator for today's event. Erin Thompson is a scholarly assistant professor with Murrow College. She is the course director for Public Speaking in the Digital Age, and she teaches reasoning and writing and crisis communication courses. Erin is also on the steering committee for a new nonprofit organization called Strides for Equality Equestrians, an organized group actively working to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in equestrian sports and the horse industry. All right, Erin, the floor is yours. Thank you for moderating today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Corey, and thank you very much to everybody tuning in for our event this afternoon. I'm very grateful and honored to be moderating the second panel in our Power of Voice series. And our speakers today, Enrique Serna, John Davis, and Carolyn Sawyer, are all outstanding graduates from Washington State University and from the Murrow College in particular. And all three are exemplary leaders in the media industry. They have many insights and experiences to share with you today. And this is a very important topic, very important conversation, and it's very encouraging to see so many of you here with us today and really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness. And I do have a series of questions to help guide the conversation. As Corey mentioned, please do feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll monitor those as we go. We may get to those throughout the conversation or save Q&A for the end, but we will definitely have time for some questions and answers with our panelists for today. And I'd like to start things off by giving each panelist a chance to introduce themselves to you before we dive into the deep conversation today. So for the panelists, if you could each please tell us your name and the year you graduated from WSU, so we get a bit of context on the time that you were here, as well as when you began working in the industry, where you currently live, and just a little bit about the work that you do, and also what interested you in participating today. So Enrique, let's start with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I appreciate it very much. My name is Enrique Serna. I live in Seattle. I attended WSU from 1971 to 75, graduated there in 75, and then came to Seattle, started my career first at Como Radio. I worked in this market and actually was very fortunate to stay in Seattle, but I worked here for over 40 years at Como Radio, King Television, back to Como as a TV news reporter, and then with KCTS 9, the public station, for 23 years. And actually, it was 3 years ago today that I retired from KCTS. And since then, I've been trying to be retired. I'm kind of semi-retired, doing just freelance work, and I've been doing quite a bit of podcasting actually lately, and so that has kept me going, and I really enjoy it. And I'm here because I was asked. I'm now on the WSU Board of Regents, which I'm thrilled about, and anything I can do to give back to the university is something that I will do.
Well, thank you for getting us started, and we really appreciate you being here with us today. John, could we turn things over to you and have you introduce yourself next, please?
Yes, my name is John Davis, and I'm a 1970 year grad of Washington State University. Went there 2.5 great years, and I had a wonderful time. And of course, got into broadcasting after an interview after a football game one time, and loved the lights and the cameras and all, and decided to just simply immerse myself from going from business classes to broadcasting classes, and made a career out of it. I spent 33 years as a broadcast journalist, most of it here in Chicago. Since that time in 2003 that I retired, and just like Enrique, I'm not, you never retire. You just, you know, do a casual swing one way or the other, and keep going with another form of your career. Currently, I have, for the past, since 2003, been working as a media and political consultant. I find a tremendous amount of gratification in leading political candidates in the right way and the right direction, and making sure that they are, you know, concerned and always on point with their constituents. And I'm just honored. I'm honored to be here today with this great panel. And I love participating in these kinds of discussions. And I'm also intrigued, of course, to learn from these experiences. And so I certainly hope that will be the case today.
Absolutely. I think we all have a lot to learn here today. And I have to say, I think you made a good choice switching from business to communication. So thank you for that. And then finally, we'll turn things over to Carolyn to please introduce yourself. Carolyn, I think.
Thank you, Erin. Yep, we got you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So happy to be with everyone. I'm going to actually work my way through these technical difficulties this evening on my end. I'm calling in from, well, Charleston, South Carolina. I've lived in South Carolina since, oh gosh, early 90s. This was my last stop on air, so to speak. I left Washington State in 1983. Finished my last year through correspondence because I had accepted a job at KHQ in Spokane. I left Spokane in order to get back to my family that was back east. And so that meant coming to work here in South Carolina, first in the Columbia market, and then from Columbia, went to Atlanta, then to ABC News, then worked in Boston, Massachusetts, and then came back to South Carolina to round out my career. That, of course, has been 25 years ago because I've been in business for 25 years. I'm an entrepreneur. I started a marketing communications company that I have ran from South Carolina, but also Washington, D.C., doing marketing communications, some government contracting, some really interesting, fascinating projects that, again, the common denominator is we work with our clients to try to help them get their messaging out. So I've been doing that now, as I said, for 25 years, and I'm hopeful and looking to retire. I don't know how that's going, but I'm enjoying and living life in Charleston and working on some interesting projects. Most recently, during the pandemic, we actually started a show that is airing on Facebook, Docs on Call. The show is an outgrowth of some work we've been doing in the health disparity space. And so I called a colleague who was in Nashville and I said, we can't sit here and not say anything. And so for the last year, we've been doing shows. We started with weekly formatting. We have since gone to a monthly magazine type format. Really thrilled that the work that we're doing was, well, it caught the attention of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And so we were funded for our work in partnership now with Simmons University, which houses the Gwen Ifill School of Media and Humanities and Arts. So we're really excited about some of the work that we're doing and looking forward to participating tonight on this discussion. A, because I was asked, but B, I just think it's important to have these kinds of dialogues so that we can better understand our current times and our future times.
Absolutely. And that is actually a great segue into the discussion, because I know in your email to me, Carolyn, you mentioned that over this past year, access to accurate information, and the elimination of misinformation has been one of your biggest focuses. So since you were already talking a little bit about the work you've been doing, could you talk about that a little bit more, especially how that relates to inequity, particularly with regard to those individuals who are underserved and often fall into the health disparities category?
Absolutely, Erin. So I think it was the misinformation element of our intent that the folks at Kellogg said. This makes perfect sense. It really speaks to the work that we've been doing with racial equity over a number of years. I actually had started working with Kellogg some years ago when they had an initiative, America Healing, and the attempt there was try to eradicate racism, which was quite a feat. And despite, I think, $30 million that they invested, as you know, we still are having our challenges. But they understood something that one of our physicians told us, and that was that in this pandemic, we were actually fighting two pandemics. One was a pandemic that obviously had COVID-19 spreading. The other was the pandemic of misinformation. And so from the very beginning, we always stayed focused on the science. We were able to reach by existing relationships with folks in the health disparity space to a whole pool of doctors that could come on a regular basis, offer clarification, give advice. And our hope has been that people have been able to heed that advice, and in this last year have been able to keep their families safe. We just did a show this past weekend, which was probably one of our most successful ones, that looked at health equity, inequity for that matter, and looked at some of the things that we're seeing in the marketplace. And unfortunately, as I said to somebody today, it's not new. Health inequity is not new. What the pandemic has done, though, has really flashed a light on how bad it is. From the spread of the disease to the vaccination.
Right, absolutely. The pandemic has definitely brought racial disparities and deeply rooted systemic racism into focus like never before. And many people are recognizing and learning about these issues for the first time, which is why it's so important to be having these conversations. And I'd like to turn it over to Enrique next. Enrique, in your email to me, you told me that the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against police shootings are important. They reflect a generational shift in our awareness of racism and the lack of police accountability. And then you said, but will it matter? So I was wondering if you could talk about this a little bit more and explain your perspective and concerns regarding that.
Well, I think that the question about will it matter means that is it going to stick? I think that one of the things that happened, and obviously the shooting of George Floyd and his killing, really, it sparked the unrest that happened across the country. Seattle had a huge amount of unrest that lasted for a tremendous amount of time. Same thing in Portland. I think I felt that it as tough as it was good because it brought this need for a shift that was also highlighted even more so by the pandemic and COVID. I mean, the racial disparities that are happening, this isn't new. These are things that have been there for a long time. Just like racism has been just a part of this country, systemic racism. I mean, it goes back to our founding fathers. It's very much part of how America was built. But I think what I felt good to see is that so many people, and not just people of color, came out to say no more. And this has got to stop, and we need to make a difference here. So to see that happen was very promising. Now the question is that where do we go from here? How do we keep it going? How do we make a difference? How do we really make it stick? And in a country that is so divided right now, where we obviously had the division made even deeper by a president who seemed to just want to sow that division for his own political purposes, not for the country. He didn't do it for the country. He wasn't doing it he was doing it for himself, let's face it. And yet it made us realize that we have a real issue regarding race in this country and a real concern about the divisions that we have. So we're really at a deep crossroads, to whether there's even, this sense of we could have a civil war again. So that's where I bring up this question of that, will it matter? Where do we go from here? And I'm hopeful that it will go somewhere positive, but I think it's really going to be a challenge. And we're being challenged really kind of like never before. But it's also a generational thing. And so I think during the times that right before I came to WSU in the early 70s, 1968, that whole era there from, the mid 60s on to 68. And so where there was a true big division in the country as well, we know we can't get through these things. But the point is, can we really do something about it? And can there be a difference made? So that's a challenge for all of us. And that's a huge question that we have to face.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I wonder if we could turn things over to John and get your thoughts on anything Enrique just had to say, or your thoughts about the momentum that the Black Lives Matter movement has gained in this past year.
Well, I see that a lot of writers have been talking about, the amount of money that went and the amount of effort that went in to these protests and trying to bring some consciousness to an America that finds itself distracted by so many things, but not the least obviously, and should, with COVID. But money has never, ever been the salve or been the solution, to overcoming these kinds of systemic problems that we see in equity and in fairness and injustice. This is really about mission. What is the mission, and can that mission then, work as a strategy over a long, long period of time until we have got it so ingrained in the consciousness of this country that it starts to change automatically, that it just sees something that is terribly and vitally wrong with negative thinking, with mistreating each other. I mean, look, I grew up in the segregated South, and we saw things that horrified, any human being. And yet we never allowed that to dispirit us, to take us off of our mark of being able to succeed, because our great grandparents and our grandparents who lived among us for a short period of time, they showed us the roadmap if you would just be consistent in your application of your demands, your commands, and show people that you're serious about what you're doing. So, I just feel a tremendous amount of excitement, frankly, about what I see today in the movement, because I believe that it has swept up so many people who don't look alike, but they feel alike, and that they are determined that this is not going to be America on their watch.
That's very well said. Carolyn, do you have any thoughts you'd like to follow up on that, comments?
The thought is that I am encouraged, very much like John. I'm encouraged in part by what I see in terms of the level of participation, particularly by young people. We're next door to Georgia, and I watched what young people did in this Georgia election, not just the general election, but in the runoff election. And that was truly amazing. But here's the deal. And I think this is the piece that I think is the difference from when we think back to what the struggles have been earlier. I think about having covered John Lewis, who's no longer with us. But when I think of the struggles they were going through, what we're going through now is this huge seismic shift in the population base. And I don't know that that can be controlled. And so it becomes more of an exercise of how do we learn to live together, and you're taking it back to the simplest denominator. I've said to clients, we live in a relatively calm city, but after we obviously saw the death of Floyd, we saw that people, were breaking out into violence in cities. And And I shared with my folks, and remember, I started this conversation by saying I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. And if you remember, a few years back, we had 9 people who were shot in a church. The city did not burn when 9 people were shot in a church. But most recently, when we experienced the uprising all across the country, we saw it here in Charleston. And I tried to say to our clients, I said, the earth is shifting, and we've got to figure out a new way, a new normal. And I think that goes the same for coming out of COVID. When we do come out of COVID, there's going to be a new normal. And so there's a new normal on so many fronts.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to learn from each other. And I feel strongly that all of us can learn by hearing about firsthand experiences, and particularly the lived experiences of you three, our panelists for today. So if we could shift a little bit and talk a bit more about your, I guess, trajectory through your careers after graduating from Washington State, and then we'll kind of circle back around to talking about where we are now. I know in the preparation for this panel, each of you shared with me a bit about your experiences and kind of personal journey of breaking into the media profession after graduating. And all 3 of you indicated that affirmative action provided a way to get a foot in the door. So I was wondering if you could share a bit about your experiences with our audience of earning that first job, like maybe a bit about the facts of what happened, but also just how did it feel as a person of color in a white dominated space to go through that hiring process and begin your first job?
Well, I'll start. My first job was at Como Radio in Seattle out of college. And I actually got hired there I think it was about 2 or 3 months before I graduated. And it was a WSU connection that helped me get that job. At the time, there was a professor at WSU that ran, well, he was a professor, but he was actually the station manager of KWSU radio, a guy named Bert Harrison, who was kind of a crusty old guy, but he took a liking to me. And he had a former student that was the general manager of a radio station at Como Radio in Seattle. And, Bert was also kind of a blunt guy and just said, look, they're looking to hire a person of color. And, you need to go for this. So he recommended me. I applied, I went over, visited, and I got hired. Which was, great, because I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do when I got out of school. And having said that, it was tough. My first 6 months on the job were very tough because I was 21 years old. I didn't really know Seattle that well, having grown up in a rural area, central Washington. And then it was my first job in a business and a highly rated station. And most of the people that worked there were white and also were like 20 to 30 years older than me. They'd been in the business a long time. And it took a while to kind of gain their trust, to also, deal with the person that was my administrator, supervisor. I had a news director and a program director. The news director was the news guy, and the news part I adapted to. Okay, the programming guy wanted me to sound a different way and all this stuff, and even asked me if I would, you sure you want to go by that name, and those types of things. And so my first 6 months there were hell, and it was just, and it really had to be with an adjustment. It was also feeling a bit like I was, whether I was feeling like I could fit, which is actually kind of how I felt when I first came to WSU, being, a young person of color, not a lot of people that were Latino that are going to the school at the time too. But somehow I managed to survive that, and was able to, I worked there for about 2.5 years before I moved to King and got into television. But it was a very challenging thing. I think the thing about being able to be hired, and, where diversity is a factor, and I think I wrote this in the email when I was talking to you, is that it can help you get into the room, but it's not going to keep you there. And you had to prove yourself. And I think in many ways, I always felt like I had to prove myself that much more in every situation I was in. And there was a lot of stress to that. And when you are one of the few people of color well, actually, I was the only one. Um, it you can feel out of place, and it was difficult. It was very challenging, but that's kind of, I think, a lot of people in our generation, we face that, and you just had to make the best of it, and you had to also show that you could do the work, because if you couldn't do the work, you weren't going to stay there. So it was a heck of a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And Carolyn, I saw you nodding along in agreement. Would you like to follow that up with some of your experiences as well?
Well, our stories are so similar. My goodness, difference in terms of time frame. I left WSU in my junior year because I had a job offer. I had started working as an intern at KHQ on the weekends. I used to take the Greyhound bus from Pullman to Spokane, every weekend, and work as anything they needed, production assistant, intern, whatever. But I got that job. I have to go back and backwards a little bit and say I got that job because I went to a Black History program at WSU back in 1983. And the speaker that evening was a woman named Bev Montgomery, who was the first Black female anchor on KHQ in Spokane. So I went to go hear a little bit about her career, and I met her afterwards, and we became fast friends. She introduced me to a national organization, the National Association of Black Journalists, which I eventually would sit on the national board for that organization and have been extremely active. I'm now a lifetime member, I'm proud to say, because NABJ does something that I think is important and unique. It provides some connectivity for you, and particularly when you're in markets where there aren't large urban centers and large African American or Latino populations or Asian populations, you name it. I think the smartest thing I did, though, because, very similarly, I caught hell. By the time I might have started as a PA, I had to prove myself, but I caught hell. I can remember my copy, getting circles all around it. And this industry, to some extent, can be so subjective, but nevertheless, there was a sentiment that I was only given the position because I was Black. You know what? I didn't buy into that. And that's important, particularly for any young people that are watching. Don't buy into that hype, because the point about your complexion or your race might get you in the door. It won't keep you in the door. And it certainly won't keep you in an industry for 40 plus years. So clearly you've got to deliver if you're going to survive in this industry. But the smartest thing I probably did, as much as I love Washington State, and I love it, to the bone. I see Seattle movies and I still cry. But as much as I love it, the smartest thing I probably did for me was to come back east, closer to my base and my family, so that I had that core of support for all the craziness that you go through in newsrooms. And then once I came back east, I came to South Carolina, and then I went to Atlanta, which is where my family was. And from Atlanta, I went to ABC News in New York. I don't think it was until I got to Boston, to be honest, that I stopped getting the tag that, I was a race hire. And that shows you, I had to go through a couple of different stations. Now, it helped that I was coming from ABC News, but by the time I got to Boston, which was the 5th largest television market in the country, people knew that, if you're here, you know what you're doing if you're gonna survive. Otherwise, it'll eat you up and you're out of there. So I think by then I could stop fighting that battle. And certainly by the time I came back to South Carolina, I always remember, you get a lot of mail, you get a lot of calls, you get a lot of comments. I'll never forget working in South Carolina when I first got here, and I got a call at the station, and a viewer was calling simply to tell me, and it was actually a compliment. He said, "You speak good for a colored gal." And this is 1984. I don't know that it's changed much these days, but nevertheless, for all the times you get the criticism, the reality was I studied my craft. I worked really hard. I had a great foundation from WSU, and that's what allowed me to be able to work all these years.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's really interesting that all three of you were able to get your first jobs in part because of the connections you made through WSU. And I know, John, your story is similar in that regard as well. So could you tell us a bit about that connection and how you were able to earn your first job through those connections from WSU?
Absolutely. I must say, first and foremost, that I'm probably one of the most fortunate uh, Black men, Black people, people of color in this country in broadcasting, because I never had a resume in my career. I was always recommended for a job. At Washington State, I was married. I met my wife at Washington State University. We had our first child as I was going into my senior year at Washington State. We lived in senior housing. And all of our friends and people and students that we had met and known, you know, always undergirded us and always supported us. So we had so much support. I mean, our families supported us. My wife is from Greece. So she didn't know anything about the United States and all of the little racial, machinations that go on. So she was, pretty pure. And a lot of her friends, of course, that lived in the dorm, they were sort of like from small little country towns and rural areas in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, what have you. But we never ever felt inadequate. And so when I went into my first job in Fresno, I was recommended by an alum, Cal Watson, who was a professor at Washington State University, the legendary Cal Watson. And I went to Fresno for an interview for the job, and at the McClatchy station in Fresno, California, KGW, KMJ, I'm sorry. And it was just so much fun because the people there, and certainly the general manager, was so down to earth and so honest. He said, if we hire you, because we don't have, there's not one on television here, 1970, in the entire Central Valley of California. If we hire you, we will not embarrass you, we will not embarrass ourselves, and we will not embarrass the Black community. Will you take the job? I mean, how do you say no to that? And so I did. I accepted the job, and it was one of the greatest rides of my life. Now there were a few, crazy moments, where some people outside of the station and in the community whom had not seen, a Black person on television before, we're going to take a few jabs just to see how thick your skin was. But none of it could ever offset the great amount of goodwill and support that I had as a young person coming out of Washington State, getting his first job. I've had a great ride, and I cannot say in any place where I've worked, whether Portland, Oregon, or here in Chicago, that it has ever been so onerous that I couldn't deal with it, or I found so much negative fault with it that I wouldn't want to be there. I relish every single opportunity and every single story and every single person practically that I've met, good or bad, because they've all, contributed to what I have ultimately become. It's been great. It's been a great ride. And if you never hear from another Black person, you heard it from me.
Well, I love your positive attitude and your enthusiasm, John. And I think that's an amazing message to be sending to all of the young people and the students watching today. I know that, despite everything turning out very well for you, it was incredibly hard work. And you not only had to prove yourself in terms of the skills associated with the job and, Carolyn and Enrique as well, but also to deal with overt racism at many points in your career. Yeah. Do you have any examples you're willing to share with our audience today about some of the things you've experienced?
Oh, yeah. Well, one of them happened here in Chicago. We had a notorious detective by the name of John Burge. And John Burge was one of these guys who assembled a team of officers, his crew. And what they did was take it upon themselves to torture mostly African-American men, up to 200 or so of them, into providing false testimony and agreeing that they committed crimes that they never ever committed. Many of them were sent to prison. Some died there. Others got out. But John Burge had a distinguished career, indistinguished career here in Chicago, much celebrated. And then it was found out through some pretty good reporting, both on the print side and the broadcast side, that John Burge was probably one of the greatest torturers of human beings ever to put on a police uniform. And of course, John, wanting to somehow clear himself and to clean up his story, his profile, called me up and offered me an exclusive interview on a boat on Lake Michigan. And he would give me an exclusive, give me the whole story, and I politely declined because I didn't want to be. I realized that he was setting all of the rules and regulations. He was setting the parameters for the interview, and I couldn't, of course, go for that. But more than that, I could not allow myself to be used, a Black man, to clean up his sordid mess of having tortured men that look just like me. So I declined. John Burge finally was accused and convicted of lying to a jury. He was sentenced to 7 years. He did 4 years, and he came out with his pension of almost $4,000 a month. He settled in Florida and died what I guess most could assume is a normal death.
That's just an incredible experience, and I'm sorry that you had to go through all of that. But again, it speaks to your attitude and positive outlook to just take the power back where you were able to and deny him that interview. Carolyn, it looked like a few minutes ago you had something maybe you wanted to add. Let me take it over to you.
I was reminded over the course of my career. So when I worked in Spokane, Washington, and I was the weekend reporter and anchor that I was assigned. Well, we generally know how that works too. There's only 1 or 2 people on the staff on the weekend anyway. So it happened to be the weekend the Aryan Nation had gotten a permit to hold a rally in downtown Spokane. And I was actually the reporter on. And so I went to cover the rally. There became a big debate journalistically as to whether or not that was a wise decision on the part of management. Do you send a Black woman to go and cover an event or group that is going to possibly incite, or the presence of that reporter might incite a riot? Again, I went, I did my job. I had mixed emotions then. I think I still do. I would hate to see the industry get to the point where there are stories we can't cover because of the race versus our skills as journalists. I fast forward, and by the time I got to Atlanta, I was assigned to a little tiny town outside of Atlanta called Forsyth County. It ended up making national news when Oprah went to Forsyth County after they had a very vicious attack on marchers that were marching through the streets of Forsyth. But my side story was, again, at this point, I'm in Atlanta. I'm a weekend anchor, but I'm also working what they called the night beat back in those days, which meant you often went out and, advanced the story for the next day. So I was sent out to do the live shot that would set up tomorrow. Hundreds of people are expected to be here for this event, et cetera. When I signed off for my live shot, and occasionally, as we all do, it's not uncommon for a reporter to drive themselves to meet your crew for the live shot, especially if you're back in the station putting together a package and then you go out there a little bit later. I turned the corner, though, to go back and get into my car to leave. And as I looked down the street, I saw a nice handful of gentlemen that were scheduled to be part of the next day's march. And so I'll never forget, being very quiet and sliding up to my car and slipping into the car and cranking the car up and driving off from Forsyth as fast as I could. So I've had some interesting assignments that I never refused. I tried to do the best possible job I could do with any assignment that was given to me. My focus has always been about excellence, but it's been an interesting, the streets were interesting years. people often ask me, do I miss it? I don't miss the day to day. I think sometimes when there's a big story, I think about the big stories, but I don't miss the day to day grind that I endured for a lot of years.
Thank you for sharing that experience. And again, I commend you on continuing to do your job and do it extremely well, even under conditions of legitimate fear. So that's incredible to hear. And Enrique, how about you? I know you have chosen and making a point of, like you referred to yourself as a race guy, right? You've made a point of covering stories about minorities and marginalized groups, and really tried to make a point of giving voice to people who wouldn't maybe otherwise have a voice.
Yeah. A couple of things I want to note before I get into that is that actually, I would have to say that my WSU connection helped me get my first job, helped me get my second job, helped me move to my third job. And the other one I managed to do on my own. But I was very fortunate to have the WSU connection. So for those students, know that that's kind of a great thing to have. If you have faculty and others that are in the business that can help you out. And I certainly had that help. And that was a great thing for me. I did a lot of what were called minority affairs shows. And I did that when I was at King. Well, I actually did it at Como, even when I was working in radio, and then at King, and back again at Como, and while I was with KCTS as well. And what I have to say about those experiences was that at times I felt frustrated because it was really sort of the only opportunity you got, for me anyway, in some of these situations. And you didn't get a lot of resources in that. But I tried to make the very best out of what I could get, because it was an opportunity for me to grow and an opportunity for me to hone my skills. So I looked at it that way when I was doing those or being assigned to those situations. And it helped me actually to become a part of the mainstream, because I used those to actually, I thought, do some decent work. And then that actually gave me the opportunity to get some other better, more mainstream assignments. But I never gave that up, because it was part of my heart and part of who I was as a person of color. And I also felt committed. So even to this day, I really look to do coverage and cover and do work that focuses on communities of color, because they're underrepresented, and I think the voices need to be heard, and there's a lot of great stories there. And as I honed my storytelling career through the years, my abilities there, I really would find good stories. And so I think in some cases, for some folks, they looked at it as a second class type of thing. Yeah, I felt that sometimes, but I was going to use it to do good work if I could do it, and help put myself in a position to get better opportunities, other things. But what I realized is that all those stories are American stories. I mean, they're part of who we are. And so I don't really like the term minority. I mean, it's people of color, communities of color, whatever. But the truth is, we're going to be the majority at some point here. And so, but we are very much a part of this country, and we have great stories. We have made huge differences. And that's what I see is an important thing to do. With a good friend of mine, I started a podcast recently. We call it Chino and Chicano. It's because my buddy Matt Chan is Chinese, and in Spanish, Chino, and I'm the Chicano, the Mexican-American guy. And what we decided to do is that both of us are retired TV guys. So what we wanted to focus on is really the things that as people of color we deal with, and oftentimes in our business, and maybe John and Carolyn can talk about this too, we had to code switch. You you would be one way when you're with white folks because you got to fit in, and another way when you're with people of color because there's a comfort level, and also you could talk about the things that were not much fun, and you could, help each other out. So one of the things we're doing with the podcast is really to talk about those things, talk about those challenges that people of color face every day. We just recorded a podcast that dropped earlier today with the Dr. Ben Danielson here in Seattle, who used to be head of the Children's Odessa Brown Clinic Medical Center. And he left that position, a very well-regarded doctor, African-American, because of racism as part of Seattle Children's. And so he basically called them out on it and said, they wouldn't make any changes. So we did a podcast with him about what he faced and kind of why he decided to do that, and also how he felt somewhat complicit that having to stay there for so long and yet not being able to make that organization change. So that's kind of part of what we're doing now in covering these things, but it's been very much a part of who I am. So I don't see a reason to give it up or not want to do it because they're great stories. And I think they're important stories. And I wanted to just quickly address one other thing. One experience that I had is that in a particular newsroom here in Seattle, where I was working, and I felt like, I was being challenged and I was not enjoying it. So I walked in and quit one day and just said, this isn't working for me, and I'm stressed out and I'm miserable, and this isn't working. So in the exit interview, I had the HR person ask me if I felt like I'd been a victim of racism. And I said, very hard for me to say that because nobody really overtly called me, you know, uh, the N word or S word or whatever. Nobody was saying anything overtly, but I said, but you have people that can make your life miserable by ignoring you and marginalizing you. And now that did happen. And then they asked me about certain people. And while I didn't name them, they named them, and then they knew who they were. That actually led to some changes in that newsroom, and also led to them, to like work to keep me. And sometimes you're going to have to stand up for yourself and call it out. And it's a tough thing to do because you put yourself on the line. And one of the reasons I didn't want to say, okay, this person is being racist against me or whatever, was because I still had young kids and I wanted to work in the business in the town. So that was a very challenging moment for me because it could have ended my television career. And, but sometimes you have to face those things and you have to stand up and you got to believe in yourself. And you also just got to say, I'm not going to take this. So anyway, I did it. That was a tough thing to deal with, but it got through it.
Thank you.
I was going to ask.
Go ahead, Carolyn. Yeah.
Can I just real quickly share, because I do want to, I want to get John in here, but I want to just share the best advice I got when I was at WSU. It was from Professor Glenn Johnson, and I don't know if he's still there. If he's retired, God bless him. But I remember him telling us, in this business, you're going to be hired, you're going to be fired, and in some instance, you might just have to walk away. And I am so glad. Oh, and laid off. Let me include laid off too. And all of those things happen in this industry. And I'm so glad he told us, because there came my point when I was in Atlanta and I was in the general manager's office and I hated the contract I had because I wasn't going to have a contract to anchor weekends and then end up anchoring the weekday all the time. That wasn't going to happen. And when I told him that, you pretty much knew I needed to go someplace. But the bottom line is I was prepared to get up and walk out, and people thought that was crazy. I went to Hawaii for a month. I got my head together and I went back and started my job at ABC News. And that was because of relationships. Many of mine, while they might have started at WSU, that code switching and relationships within NABJ has been tremendous for me. That's where I directly point to connecting and getting to the network, which was my personal goal when I came to school there at WSU. John?
Well, these our stories mirror so much, but here in Chicago, I don't know how many of you know much about Chicago, but it is, as far as I'm concerned, and so many people who play the game of politics, probably the most politically oriented city in America. And that goes for everything. Politics permeates every single cell in Chicago. And so, it's very difficult not to get swept up in it. I mean, when you have Minister Farrakhan on one side, you got Jesse Jackson here, you had Rahm Emanuel, had Richard Daley. I mean, you had, some powerhouses of political influence in this city. And when you're a reporter out there and you're making or made a name for yourself, you will find any and all of these people tugging at you for your specific use, as for influence. And many times I just had to push back and then punch back a couple of times at people who just simply want to, get to you, to use you, and then you make some enemies sometimes. Sometimes those enemies force you into your general manager's office or your news director's office, where they've made some allegations, and it's up to you then to prove yourself innocent to people who shouldn't even have a voice in how I cover a news story out there in the street, sometimes involving them. So I was beset by one of those problems once, and I decided to just simply walk off. I packed up a few things from my desk, and I came home, and I sat here in my house for about 2 or 3 days, and then the two top anchor people at the station called and asked me what would it take for me to come back. And I told them that the news director at the time would have to be gone, and then I would have to get the story. I wanted the story that I had pitched, that they had given me the go-ahead to do. And on the day that I came to do the story, the news director and the general manager decided, well, that story's too big for you. It's an international story, and we'll let New York or the network take care of it. When they didn't realize that the path was cut for me to do the story, not somebody else, because of these political influences in Chicago had paved the way in that particular regard. And so I came back about a week later, and that news director and that general manager were both gone. Now, that's nothing to beat your chest about, but it was just purely wrong. And these people, these anchor people, I saw how much pressure and how much influence they could exert. And they were willing to help me. And I got the story that I wanted to do, which was to be in South Africa when Nelson Mandela got out of prison, and was one of the first, if not the first, Black newsman, broadcast newsman in America to interview him. And I was very, very pleased with that. I met him several other times. And when he came to Chicago, we had a great time when he was on his American tour. I was there at every single stop with him. So it all worked out. But sometimes, as you said, you got to stand up, and you cannot cower when you believe that you're right, even if it means walking away from your job.
That's absolutely incredible about Nelson Mandela and all of it, really. And I want to come back to the theme, or the topic of our panel, is the power of voice. And I think you're all getting to that, which will be a perfect segue here in just a minute. We did have a question coming in from YouTube for either John and or Enrique. Did either one of you have a memorable piece of advice from a WSU connection, similar to the one that Carolyn shared about her piece of advice from Glenn Johnson?
I can't remember anything particular anyone said, other than that I could turn to folks for support. I look back at Bert Harrison, who opened the door for me to get my first job. There was the fellow that was the chair of the department when I was there, whose name escapes me right now. I think it was Don Wells was his name. Anyway, he had helped me get a fellowship in New York City before my senior year. And he came to me and asked me to apply for it, and then came back to me and told me that they had turned me down only because they didn't have a broadcast element that they were assigning people to for the fellowship. And then he asked me if I would take something else, and I did. And then he got me into it. So there were people there that were just, great mentors and there to support, to help you out, to get the kind of experience you needed. And but I think the thing that I learned, it was interesting what Carolyn said, is that you do have to learn that it is a business where it can change, and you be prepared for you could be fired, you can be hired, you can be, all these different things that happen. I think the best thing one thing that I learned more than anything else is that you have to be flexible and adaptable, and that things won't always go your way and things will change. The other part of it is if you want to be a reporter, and particularly in these times, it's tough because the business is really facing just broadcasting and media itself are facing just so many challenges from a financial standpoint. But you have to be able to reinvent yourself sometimes. And, from either the way technology changes to making sure that you're staying ahead of the game and understanding all of that. And maybe taking a chance on something that you could never see yourself doing, but if you try it. One of the things that I ended up doing was that I spent some time, about 7 years, as a manager at KCTS. I was actually also our main talent and still doing some reporting. It was a PBS station, but I also was the manager of the production department, and it was actually a really good experience because I really got a sense of what it was like to have to manage people, which isn't much different from when you're reporting and dealing with people, but how you, which eventually helped me when I was working more on my own on a freelance basis. So, it's a way of getting other skills. So being open to that, and just knowing too that the way the business is changing and all of that is that you got to be flexible, you got to be adaptable, and look for those opportunities that are going to benefit you.
I just read I was just reading the chat. Thank you, Tammy Berry, for sharing the note about, I didn't realize Glenn was the mayor in Pullman. That is hilarious. I've got to make a trip back. No, huge impact. It was a great teacher to have. Val Lindbergh is the other person I remember who was there when I was there in the 80s. I was just sitting here thinking as you were talking, and I thought, you know what, I left that campus in 1983. And for all the changes that this industry has, for all the wildness, the craziness, the people you work for who probably shouldn't be managers. But in spite of all that, I have worked since 1983, which is probably why I want to retire, right? I have had opportunities. I have been open to, being flexible, open to changes in the industry. My number one rule is you should learn something new every single day. So you should be a lifelong learner, always be learning something. But when I sit here and think about it, and particularly in these times that we're seeing in the news now, where people have been unemployed for the last year because their jobs have gone away because of COVID, or their skills are no longer needed in the marketplace. I mean, I just think, Jesus, I have worked since 1983. So I'm very grateful and thankful for that, and very thankful for the education that I got there in Pullman.
Interesting. Val Lindbergh was my advisor when I was there too. So, Val was someone that I used to play golf with him every now and then. And in fact, we used to make him go to parties with us occasionally. But, this was someone that really was a legendary person in the department there. One thing I was very fortunate is that I I never got fired. I'm sure that I came close numerous times, but that was one thing that I never got laid off. Fortunately, I'm sure I was close on those things too. Um, but again, the thing to adapt. One of the things that I ended up doing during this time of COVID, I was retired, but I had other people come to me and say, "Hey, are you open to doing, some producing or uh, just, doing some interviewing and things like that?" So I you know, learned how to really manipulate and use Zoom to do podcasting, uh, do audio editing, do video editing. I might kind of turn my condo into a studio, and have done really quite a bit of virtual interviewing, and that I've done with stories. And in some cases, I've shot stories with my iPhone, and uh, so it's actually been a lot kind of fun for me in a way, because some of the skills that I I I didn't really use that much when I was still at KCTS, because um, just the type of programming we were doing there. We had shooters and all of that, but on my own, I had time to adapt and to learn all these things, and it's been that whole idea of being a lifelong learner, I think, is very, very important. Um, and you can use your skills in other ways. You'll never know how things will come up, and you can adapt and to those things. So um, I've done a lot of virtual interviewing, moderating, facilitating, and then storytelling, and it's actually been kind of fun and a little lucrative as well on the side. So yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. And I think it's interesting to hear about all the ways that all three of you have worked throughout your entire career to amplify your own voices, as well as give voice to other people who deserve to be heard. And John, I know you also had mentioned to me that you done some adaptations this past year in COVID to find ways to continue working virtually and continue adapting. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
What I think the theme here is never stop learning, and then to always, kind of shift and drift if you have to continue to relate. There are so many ways to get the platforms that you need to do one chore or another. Thank God we've got Zoom. Thank God we've got the internet. Thank God we've got these information tools and sources that we can always go to. Whether you want to do a faucet, I mean, you could do a faucet just by going online and looking it up. But the one thing that I must say in regards to our business of communicating is that one thing that should never ever change, and that is the truth. Now, as truth givers and seekers, I think it's incumbent upon us to go and just ferret out, work as hard as we have to, and encourage our students and encourage those who want to be in this business or in this business. Remind them that no one had to go to Richard C. Hottelet or Edward R. Murrow to remind them to be truthful in what they reported or what they wrote. And I don't think that ever should be a question, and it should never ever be one of those question marks out there, or a signpost. Truth prevails in everything that we do, and I don't know. I that's where my passion lies. I mean, we can reinvent ourselves in any number of ways that we want, but as far as writing and telling stories and influencing other people and raising the voices of those people who don't have much of a voice, giving them the encouragement and the instruction that they need. I'm sure that that Carolyn has the same thing as a as a person who counsels and has this business. that you have to have people who are, you want to be able to give them the best advice, and I get so wrapped up, I guess, in wanting to do so many things that I'll just go back to my original, which was, just keep relating to people, and keep making yourself relevant, and keep changing and adapting for as long as you want to be able to be in this business of communications.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Erin, one of the things that I think I'm hearing as well that I want to emphasize to those who are thinking about embarking in this industry, integrity matters. Integrity absolutely matters. And I am looking at and listening to two gentlemen of very high integrity. And that's what I think, that and the hard work keeps you in the game. You got to be able to pivot, yes, but those qualities are what keeps you in the game. It made me, Enrique, think of the one time I fired is a strong word, but as we know in this industry, when you get to the negotiation table for a contract renewal and they don't offer you a contract, you're as good as fired, right? And that is exactly what happened in my last station endeavor. But what I'm so thankful for, and I was able to be thankful then as well, is that it forced me to do things that I really hadn't thought about doing. And the beauty then was the skill set that I picked up when I was in school. The best thing about the WSU program is that while you might go there and you want to be, you want to be Edward Murrow, the reality is you're going to get a little bit of everything. You're going to learn a little bit about marketing, a little bit about advertising, a little bit about public relations. And lo and behold, the night that I signed off of the air and simply said, I'm out of here, I got back to my desk and I had my very first client in my company, which was a school district that wanted me to come in and do media training for their principals. I had another client that knew my skill sets and the integrity factor, who wanted me to come and work for their nonprofit and provide public relations support. So while my degree was communications with an emphasis on broadcasting, what was so beautiful is that I had all of those other entrees that I had to partake of while I was there. And by the time I did reach that point where I wasn't doing another television contract, I still had an opportunity to work and use skills that I picked up along the way. So for that, I am grateful. And so of my list of things that Professor Johnson told me, I haven't been laid off, thank the good Lord. And I joke as an entrepreneur, having been in business now for 25 years, I tell people all the time, they say, what do you love the most about it? I said, well, because I know when I'm going to be fired and I know when I'm going to be laid off. It's the day that I stop getting out here to look for new opportunities for me and my team. So again, I'm so very thankful for having that diversity in the education.
That's fantastic, Carolyn. Thank you. And I think we will have some time to take questions from the audience. So if anybody has questions, you're welcome to put those into the chat, and then I can direct those to the panelists individually or as a group, and then whoever would like to take those can take them. I would like to wrap the conversation back around to address equity a bit more as we start to finish up today. And hopefully people who are joining us today and listening to this conversation recognize that we have a lot of work to do. And thinking back to some of the stories that our three panelists shared with us earlier today about some of the experiences and struggles that they've been through, and the fact that really working toward equity is all of our problem, right? We all need to cooperate and work toward this together. So I'm wondering one specific question for the panelists, and whichever of you would like to take this may go ahead. How do you have conversations with colleagues to help them address biases that they may not see that they have? How do you approach those sorts of tough conversations? John?
Well, I think the best way is again to take them aside and make sure that they realize that they have been an affront. They have somehow, drifted off the mark of fairness and lost their insight into perhaps sometimes even going so far as losing their insight into common decency. I'm on the board of the Holocaust Museum, and the one thing that I get from this experience is that I'm always reminded every single day of how little room it takes to drift from sanity to insanity, to go from what you know to be right and decent to drifting away just ever so slightly into an area that you don't recognize, and people will not recognize you as a result of that drift. So, you know, I'm grounded every day, it seems, by my experiences at the museum, and that way, I think it gives me even more credibility when I start reaching out to individuals, either professionally or personally, to make sure that they know that is not who they really are. And if they want to continue to be relevant and to be respected, then they really should put a check on themselves and perhaps find another sort of like benchmark, for, if you will, for the kind of quality that people want them to be, that people expect for them to be, that people want and really desire for them to be. We desire people around us who are decent and who are caring and are sensitive. And yet, if we get a person that we thought was that way, and all of a sudden they have now revealed themselves as something else, it's jarring. And yet, you know, we've got to continue to inspire and to reinforce each other. That's what I do. I mean, I make sure that my antenna are always up to those kinds of conversations. And if I'm asked, and sometimes even I'll impose, that I will make sure that they realize that, you know, there's a better way, and you know the better way. So just be better.
Erin, I don't know if anybody's acknowledged it, but John Davis was a Hall of Achievement Award winner. And we're all very, very proud of her. I'm probably one of the oldest. I graduated in '63, and I love hearing the three of you speak. It's just great to know that there's still people caring about ethics, that are willing to stand up for themselves, believe in themselves, and also willing to help others and extend the hand behind. And I'm just so proud of all of you. So thank you.
Hey, I'm proud of Kay White. I tell you, we had some good times. We had good times.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
He's super.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that they knew that you're a special guy and you earned a special award there.
Absolutely.
I wanted to mention an experience that I had with a manager during my career. That I had a colleague who was African American, who was at the time producing public service announcements at one of the stations that I worked at, and he voiced the spot. He was actually quite a talented guy, but a particular manager came into a meeting that we were in and said that he didn't want to have that person voicing any more spots because he sounded too black. And I remember like kind of melting down about that because I just was outraged. I mean, I can think of a few other words to say, but and having pretty heated conversation about the whole thing, because it was just one of those moments where you're just like, okay, I can't believe you're saying this. And I, at one point I just said, okay, well, wait a minute. Then if you have somebody else doing this, are you going to say that they're too white sounding, you know, or what is that? I mean, you know, I've had people tell me that, you know, they're surprised that I don't have any kind of accent, you know, and it's just like, anyway, I was just floored by all of that. But it was a moment where, and I was really floored too because I was in a room with, and that particular African American PSA producer wasn't in the room at the time, and actually I was the only person of color in there, and nobody really melted down about it. Of course, I did, but there was a longer conversation that ended up happening with other managers and general manager about this comment. So, it just sometimes people can blow you away just by their own just incoherent bias, I call it. But you got to call that stuff out, and I think it's more and more important these days for us to be vigilant about those things. Of course, I think people are, definitely kind of on high alert more and more these days. But these are experiences that yet you might have, and you got to be ready to just say, hey, that's like not acceptable, and it's unfortunately still happening.
Carolyn?
I could not agree more in terms of you need to be prepared and comfortable calling people out. If you don't say anything, we got a problem. I think you become part of the problem by not saying anything. Obviously, over the years, I've learned to be a little bit more diplomatic in how I might call one out. I also think it doesn't hurt you to be strategic in calling someone out and understanding what might be the motivator. I was thinking about this recently. I just had another woman-owned business owner who started this chatter on the social media, and she was very critical of women who were getting excited on inauguration. And she said she didn't understand why women were wearing chucks and wearing pearls. Why would they be admiring these women? And I read all the thread, and then I finally came out and I simply called her on it. And I said, Elaine, what you've done is sad. And she said, well, Carolyn, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to disagree. And I said, that's not what we're doing here. I said, what you have done is created a platform for other people to take shots at women. And you could just watch it deteriorating as they were being critical of women and suggesting that women, they couldn't do their own thinking, and that these women who were on that platform weren't accomplished. I mean, it just went on. And I said, and that's sad. And I said, and let me remind you that as you went through your career and had your successes, there were tons of us cheering you on. And what I came to realize is that why she was probably more critical is that she was a little pained about perhaps not feeling that support from other women as she was coming along in her career. So it's important to understand what the motivator is sometimes, and that can help you to effectively get to a person and pull them back and just say, no, it's wrong. It's just wrong. There's no way that I'm ever going to endorse you creating a forum. And I remind her again, I cheered you on when you had your successes. And so we have to not be afraid to call people out.
Very well said, right? Because if we choose to stay silent, we are participating in that oppression. So I'm glad that all of you mentioned those things. We are getting a little bit close on time, but we do have a question from Tracy in the chat. She's wondering about what steps we can take to increase diversity in our newsrooms.
I think one of the important things is that having people that look like us in the management positions. That still is a constant battle, I think. And I think that there have been times when managers they fail to really make the effort to try to find more defined people of color that can fit roles, and to make to go out and recruit, because people are there, but it's a matter of like making a commitment to do that. So that's a part of an organization's commitment upon having a diverse newsroom and knowing that what it can bring to you, because the more diversity you have in the newsroom, it's going to help your coverage and your storytelling. And that's the mindset that you really have to have. But I think the bigger part of it too is that there needs to be more of us in those positions of leadership, so that we're aware of those things, that we can make a difference there.
Also, I think it's very necessary. We're talking about diversity. I mean, it's okay to have a diverse newsroom, but if those diverse and divergent voices don't bring their own quality, their own learned experiences and backgrounds, to bear in the newsroom, then it's just a sort of a generic, wash of a place. Everybody's kind of dancing and walking to the same drum beat. You have to bring your perspective and your background and your knowledge. I didn't want to be just like everybody else. I mean, why even hire me? If I'm going to be just like everybody else, I have a unique background, I have unique experiences, and those should be brought to the surface, as part of your quality of being a different person within that newsroom. I don't want to have a conversation with myself all day long. I want to talk to people who have a divergent opinion or perspective, and can teach everybody in the newsroom something. We've got some of those newsrooms here, and they are spectacular. They are really, really, I think, great examples of what can be done when there's a conscious effort to make sure not only that the faces are diverse, but that the opinions are matter from those diverse faces.
I have mentioned the National Association of Black Journalists a couple of times during the call. I'll echo that again and encourage that if there is not a chapter on campus, it might be something that the college would explore. And certainly if not a chapter, because I don't know what your numbers look like. I know when I was there, the numbers were thin, so I don't know if the numbers in terms of diversity are up, but if not just an affiliation and association with that organization, which by the way meets, I think it's every 3 to 5 years, with the National Hispanic Journalists as well as the Asian American Association of Journalists. And so they do networking at that level. I mean, in this day and age, you can ask someone. When I came into this business, I was that one generation ahead of, I think in the 70s, and you all might remember, I can remember specifically some news directors literally hiring like hairdressers because they couldn't find anyone. So they said that had journalism experience and a background. So they would run into, or they'd see somebody who was a person of color and they would hire them and bring them in and try to train them. And that had some challenges to it because everyone didn't pick up the ball and move as fast or was not as successful. And that created, I think, some backdraft for us, but we're way past that. I look now and I just smile. I look at Craig Melvin, who was our high school reporter here in South Carolina and grew up in this community, who started at our TV station as a high school reporter, and we mentored him and we showed him the ropes and we encouraged him. And where does he sit today? He sits on the Today Show. And I look at others, I'm a huge fan of Abby Phillips at CNN, who just got a huge promotion. I mean, those individuals are all over the place. So in this day and age, it's really hard to tell me you're having a hard time finding or hiring a person of color. That line just doesn't work in 2021.
Absolutely. Well, we have flown through an hour and a half of conversation with the three of you, and it has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel this afternoon, and thank you to everybody who has been watching as well. I know all of the students that are watching today, you just gained so many amazing pieces of wisdom and nuggets of advice from three very successful people. And whether or not you're going into the communications industry or otherwise, that's all really, really great advice. Two couple of quick things before we finish out today. We will continue this conversation at this year's Murrow Symposium on March 30th and 31st. and registration does begin on Monday, February 22nd. So please be sure to register on the website at murrow.wsu.edu. And second, as a reminder, if you're a student joining for Common Reading credit today, make sure you do fill out the link that Karen put in the chat a little bit ago so that you can get credit for today. And just wanted to say thank you very much for everybody who participated today. And Carolyn, John, and Enrique, we really appreciate your desire to give back to the Murrow College and for sharing your insights and wisdom with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. You were fantastic as a moderator and appreciate you.
Thank you.